In the early hours before dawn, somewhere along the Danube frontier, in approximately the year 170 of the Common Era, a man sat alone inside a campaign tent with a small oil lamp and an open manuscript. Outside, the sounds of a Roman army at rest moved through the darkness, the low voices of sentries at the perimeter, the occasional shift of horses tethered beyond the firelight, the river itself carrying its cold northern sound across the distance between his tent and the water. The household had not yet risen. The first dispatches of the morning had not yet arrived. There was, for this particular hour, nothing yet required of him. He was writing in Greek. This detail, small, specific, easy to pass over, carries a weight that accumulates slowly. The Roman Empire conducted its administration in Latin. Its orders moved in Latin. Its laws were argued in Latin. Its correspondence with provincial governors and military tribunes arrived in Latin and departed the same way. A man who ruled this empire from the center outward, who bore the title Augustus and the accumulated authority of the Antonine dynasty, would have been expected to think in the language of command. He was not thinking in the language of command. The Greek he was writing was the language of examination, of philosophy, of the long Greek tradition of asking what a person owes to themselves before they can understand what they owe to anyone else. It was the language not of the empire's edge, but of the mind's interior. That he chose it here in the dark, before the day had made its first claim on him, tells something about the distance between the office he held and the person who held it. His name was Marcus Aurelius. He had been emperor for 9 years by this point, and would be emperor for another decade. The world he governed was, by almost any ancient accounting, the largest and most complex political entity human civilization had yet produced. 5 million square kilometers of territory, stretching from the Atlantic coast of Hispania to the Euphrates, from the northern forests of Britannia to the Saharan margins of North Africa. Within this territory lived somewhere between 50 and 60 million people, speaking dozens of languages, practicing hundreds of local customs, governed through a bureaucratic architecture of provinces and municipalities and legal jurisdictions whose administration required the daily movement of a volume of correspondence that no single mind could fully hold. Legal appeals arrived from Alexandria and from Leon. Military dispatches came from the Parthian frontier and from the Rhine. Tax disputes wound their way through provincial courts and eventually toward the emperor's desk, which in this season was not in Rome, but in a tent that smelled of wood smoke and damp wool, positioned alongside an army conducting a war Marcus had not chosen and could not yet end. The Danube was the empire's northern boundary in this region, the line beyond which the Germanic and Sarmatian peoples lived, in a relationship with Rome that shifted between uneasy accommodation and open conflict. The Marcomanni, a Germanic confederation whose territorial ambitions had been a pressure on the frontier for generations, had in recent years pushed across the river in ways that earlier diplomatic management had failed to contain. The war that followed, the Marcomannic Wars, as historians would eventually call them, was not a war Marcus had sought or welcomed. It was a war the situation required, in the specific way that situations sometimes require things of people who would have chosen otherwise. He had come north to conduct it with the full weight of imperial authority, which meant living in the field for years at a time, making strategic decisions under the pressures of incomplete information and divided counsel, and continuing in this same tent, or one like it, to write in Greek, in the hours before dawn, the private philosophical record that no one else was intended to read. The question of why a man of philosophical temperament would submit to this when the empire would have permitted him a quieter and more comfortable version of the same life, is not a question with a quick answer. It opens onto the whole of what he was, and what he believed, and what he thought the universe required of a person who understood it as clearly as he was trying to. Edward Gibbon, writing in the 18th century his monumental history of Rome's decline and fall, paused over the Antonine dynasty with an admiration that carries across the centuries with unusual warmth. The period of the five good emperors, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, represented for Gibbon the era in which the human race had been most happy and most prosperous. This is a judgment that has attracted argument and qualification from subsequent historians, but its core recognition holds that there are moments in political history when the person at the center is genuinely oriented toward the welfare of those they govern, and that this orientation produces at the civilizational level something distinct from what either ambition or indifference produces. Gibbon was not claiming that the Antonine emperors had achieved philosophical perfection or eliminated suffering from the empire they governed. He was making the more specific observation that they governed with the quality of attention that distinguishes genuine administration from the mere exercise of power, and that this quality, maintained across several successive reigns, had shaped the experience of millions of people in ways that were measurable and real. Marcus Aurelius was the last of them. He had been adopted into the imperial succession by Antoninus Pius, who had himself been adopted by Hadrian, creating the deliberate lineage of chosen philosophical governance rather than biological inheritance that defined the dynasty's particular character. He had spent his youth and early adulthood in the careful cultivation of the philosophical education Antoninus had intended for him, rhetoric, jurisprudence, and above all the Stoic tradition, which he pursued with the seriousness of someone who understood that it was not an intellectual ornament, but a set of tools he would one day need under genuine pressure. When Antoninus died in 161 and Marcus came to the throne, the transition had the quality of a philosophical inheritance rather than merely a political one. What Marcus received from Antoninus was not simply authority, but a model of what authority looked like when it was held carefully, without vanity, without the performance of power for its own sake. He would return to Antoninus again and again throughout his life, in the private writings that have survived him, with the particular quality of admiration that is less emotional than architectural, the way a person returns to a structure they have studied and found, after years of examining other structures, to be genuinely sound. Antoninus had been calm without being cold. He had been patient without being passive. He had conducted the business of governing one of history's largest empires with a steadiness that Marcus found neither accidental nor effortless, but deliberately cultivated across decades of philosophical practice. The model was useful precisely because it was real, not an ideal constructed in a philosopher's garden, but a life actually lived in the conditions of actual power, with all the friction and compromise those conditions impose. The tent along the Danube was Marcus's garden, or rather, it was the anti-garden, the place most unlike what philosophical tradition imagined as the appropriate setting for serious thought, and therefore the place where serious thought was most genuinely tested. The ancient philosophical schools had their preferred geographies: the Academy's sacred grove, Epicurus's garden within Athens's walls, the Stoa Poikiles, covered walkway, where Zeno had first gathered his students. These were places set apart from the claims of ordinary life, spaces designed to encourage the kind of sustained attention that philosophy requires. Marcus had none of this. What he had was a frontier encampment, a war in progress, the daily requirements of imperial administration, and the hours before dawn when the tent was still quiet enough to hear himself think. That he used those hours to write rather than to sleep tells something about the seriousness with which he held the philosophical practice. That he wrote in Greek rather than Latin tells something about the private inward direction of the writing, and that the manuscript was never prepared for circulation, never edited for a reader, never given a title during his lifetime, tells perhaps the most important thing of all, that the writing was not for the empire, not for posterity, not for the philosophical schools whose ideas he was drawing upon, but for himself alone, in the dark, before the day arrived and took him back. The world that day would take him back into was enormous in a way that the word enormous only approximates. Consider the physical scale of the correspondence alone, the legal appeals from provincial courts, each representing a person whose life was affected by whether the case was heard carefully or carelessly, the military dispatches from the Rhine and the Danube and the Parthian frontier, each requiring decisions about troop positioning and supply logistics and diplomatic overture, the senatorial correspondence from Rome, carrying the political currents of a city that continued its ceremonial and administrative life even when the emperor was 3 weeks' ride away. All of this arrived and was processed and required response, day after day, in a setting that smelled of the horses outside, and the cold of the northern climate, and the particular staleness of a tent that has been occupied for a long campaign season. The philosophical question this raises, whether any single rational mind can justly govern a world of such scale and diversity, whether the administrative complexity of empire is compatible with the kind of attention that genuine governance requires, is not a question Marcus escaped by asking it. He lived inside it and continued working. The Antonine Plague had arrived before the Marcomannic Wars in 165 or 166, returning to the empire with the legions from the Parthian campaign in the east. What it was exactly, smallpox, measles, some combination of diseases whose specific identities have not survived in the ancient medical record with enough clarity to permit certainty, is less important than what it did. It moved through the empire along the same routes that trade and military movement had opened, following the roads and the rivers and the grain shipments, arriving in cities and villages and legionary camps with the indifference of something that has no knowledge of borders or administrative categories. The estimates historians have assembled from scattered ancient sources suggest somewhere in the range of 5 million deaths across the course of the epidemic, though the range of uncertainty around that figure is wide. What is not uncertain is the quality of the disruption: agricultural labor interrupted, trade networks damaged, urban populations reduced in ways that left administrative records incomplete, and tax bases uncertain, and the fabric of provincial life changed in ways that would take years to assess. Marcus ordered grain shipments to affected provinces. He adjusted tax obligations in regions where the labor force had been depleted. He continued the administrative machinery of imperial governance through the epidemic's years with the specific quality of attention that is neither heroic nor indifferent, but simply continuous, the ongoing application of whatever resources were available to the problem immediately at hand. The grain carts moved through streets that were quieter than they had been. The dispatches continued to arrive at the tent along the Danube, where the correspondence about the plague and the correspondence about the war occupied the same desk, and the man at that desk continued to write, in the hours before dawn, in Greek, about what the universe requires of a person who understands their place within it. The cosmological question the plague raised, how mass mortality and suffering can occur within a universe the Stoics held to be governed by rational necessity rather than random chaos, was not a question Marcus could resolve in the abstract and then put aside. It was a question he lived with, in conditions that made the abstract personal and the personal inescapable. The philosophical tradition he had inherited offered resources for approaching this question, tools for holding it without being destroyed by it, ways of thinking about mortality and loss that the Stoics had developed across 500 years of argument. But tools require hands that are strong enough to use them, and strength of that kind is not given once and held permanently. It has to be returned to. It wears and has to be renewed. The manuscript in the tent was, among other things, the record of that renewal, the repeated morning effort to reconnect the philosophical principles to the day's actual requirements before the dispatches arrived and the requirements became specific. What Gibbon had seen across the distance of 15 centuries was the quality this effort produced at the civilizational level. But the effort itself was invisible to Gibbon and has remained largely invisible to the historical imagination that remembers Marcus primarily as a philosopher-emperor, a paradox made human, a symbol of something that governance rarely achieves. The paradox is real, the symbol is not false, but neither quite captures the texture of what was actually happening in the tent along the Danube, where the philosophy was not a public performance or a philosophical achievement, but a daily private struggle conducted in Greek, in the dark, against the considerable resistance of exhaustion and doubt, and the accumulated weight of years of military command. The dynasty Marcus inherited had been, in Gibbon's assessment, the best the ancient world had produced. The dynasty Marcus would leave behind, succeeded immediately upon his death by his son Commodus, whose reign dismantled within years what the Antonine succession had built across decades, is a different kind of historical fact, and one that raises a question with no comfortable answer. If the quality of governance depends primarily on the philosophical cultivation of the individual at the center, what happens when that cultivation is not transmitted? The Antonine dynasty had solved the succession problem by adoption, by choosing heirs on the basis of philosophical and temperamental fitness rather than biological relationship. Marcus, for reasons that ancient historians debated even in his own lifetime, and that modern historians have continued to find difficult to interpret, chose his biological son. The choice ended what had made the dynasty remarkable. Whether this constitutes a philosophical failure, a human one, or simply the inevitable limit of what individual virtue can achieve within institutional structures that cannot reproduce it without structural support. This is a question that does not resolve into a single answer and is not meant to. What it does is locate Marcus's story within a larger and older question about the relationship between the person and the institution, the philosopher and the political order, the genuine effort to govern well, and the conditions that make such governance possible or impossible over time. Marcus was the outermost limit of what the Antonine project could achieve. He was also its most honest embodiment, the one who, unlike his predecessors, left a private record of how much the achievement cost and how continuously it had to be chosen. The city of Rome, seen from the Palatine Hill at dusk in the years of Marcus's reign, extended toward a horizon he could not fully see and would not live to understand. The forums and temples and colonnaded streets of a city that housed perhaps 1,000,000 people lay below and beyond the hill's edge, organized by centuries of accumulated decision and redesign into something that looked from above like a civilization that had achieved a kind of permanence. The aqueducts brought water from the hills. The Tiber moved through the city's center carrying its regular commerce. The Forum of Trajan, which Marcus's adoptive great-grandfather had constructed with the treasury of Dacian conquest, rose with the particular confidence of architecture that expects to last. None of this was Marcus's doing in the architectural sense. He had not built Rome, had not designed its institutions, had not originated the legal tradition, or the military system, or the provincial governance structures. He administered daily. What he had done was inhabit the center of this inheritance with the philosophical seriousness it required, holding the machinery of an enormous civilization in continuous operation through the specific quality of attention he brought to each day's decisions. And then he had gone north to the Danube, where the empire was not a view from a hill, but a line in the ground that hostile peoples were pushing against, and where the quality of governance was measured not in architectural permanence, but in the daily decisions of a man in a tent who wrote in Greek before dawn and then put the manuscript aside when the dispatches arrived. Antoninus Pius, his adoptive father and the predecessor whose example Marcus returned to throughout the meditations with consistent, unhurried admiration, had governed without going to war. He had conducted the business of the empire through legates and administrators, from Rome and from his country estates, maintaining the stability his predecessors had built without the military drama that characterized many imperial reigns. Marcus had admired this deeply and had found in Antoninus's example not the model of philosophical governance in ideal conditions, but the model of measured governance in ordinary ones, the steady application of careful judgment to the continuous and undramatic requirements of administration, day after day, without the self-congratulation that would have made it easier to maintain. The wars came anyway. The plague came anyway. The conditions Marcus actually governed and bore little resemblance to the conditions Antoninus had navigated, and the philosophical tools Antoninus's example demonstrated had to be used under pressures Antoninus had not faced in the same form. This is the nature of inherited models. They show what is possible in certain conditions, and they leave the question of what is possible in different conditions to the person who must face them. Marcus faced his conditions with the model of Antoninus in mind, and the Stoic tradition in hand, and the private manuscript on the desk. And he continued, not triumphantly, not serenely, not with the philosophical composure that the image of the philosopher emperor implies. He continued with the particular quality of effort that the manuscript records, the repeated return to the same principles, the same arguments, for the same commands to himself, to rise and work, and pay attention, and hold the philosophical practice together against the considerable resistance of daily life in an encampment on the edge of an empire at war. In the later years of the Marcomannic Wars, as the campaigns extended past what any early strategic assessment had projected, and the frontier remained unresolved, and Marcus's health was declining in ways he recognized and recorded, with the calm attention he brought to everything, he rode north again. There is something in the historical record that suggests he understood the final campaign might be final in more than the military sense, that he was riding toward a conclusion of some kind, though the exact shape of that conclusion was not yet visible. He went anyway, not because the circumstances had improved, or because the philosophical work had been completed, or because the conditions of the empire had become ones that made governance feel like philosophy's natural expression, rather than philosophy's most demanding test. He went because the situation required it, and because he was the person whose situation it was, and because the question of what the universe requires of a person who understands their place within it had, across the years of manuscript and campaign and plague and administration, resolved into something that looked less like an answer and more like a practice, the daily renewable, unfinished act of choosing to meet the day's requirements with whatever measure of attention and equanimity could be assembled in the pre-dawn hours before the dispatches arrived. A person's circumstances do not choose them. The Danube was where it was, the Marcomanni were where they were, the empire was the size it was, and the plague had been what it was, and the succession had unfolded through adoption and philosophical intention into the specific fact of Marcus Aurelius holding the center of it. What remained fully his own was not the circumstances but the response, the Greek manuscript open on the camp desk, the lamp burning its small steady light into the dark, the returning morning effort to connect the philosophical principles to the actual requirements of the day, and the riding north when the day's requirements pointed north, and the doing of this not because it was easy or chosen or philosophically comfortable, but because the universe, as he understood it, had placed him there, and understanding your place within a thing is not separate from living up to what that place requires. The empire would continue without him, and then with difficulty without him, and eventually in forms he could not have anticipated. The manuscript would survive, copied by hands centuries removed from the tent where it was written, and find readers in situations as various as any empire encompasses. The lamp would go out, as lamps do, when the oil was finished, but the hours it had burned, and the pages written under its light, and the particular quality of philosophical seriousness brought to the work of governance by the man who had written them, these had already done what they were going to do, which was to hold, for a particular span of years in a particular civilization at its particular historical moment, be the center of an enormous and complicated world together, imperfectly and continuously, one long pre-dawn morning after another. In Greek, Epictetus was somewhere in the middle of a lecture when he stopped and asked his students what exactly they thought had been taken from them. The room in Nicopolis was not large. It held the kind of students who had traveled some distance to hear him, young men from good families, a few older ones who had come later to philosophy than they would have liked, all of them sitting in that particular posture of people who are listening hard and have not yet understood what they are listening for. Epictetus waited. He was not performing patience. He was simply a man who had learned, over a long life, that the silence after a question does more philosophical work than most answers. His body bore the record of what had been done to him. The leg, broken by a master who had wanted to demonstrate that he could break it, had left him with a gait that everyone in Nicopolis recognized. He never discussed it with apparent bitterness. He mentioned it sometimes the way a carpenter might mention a warped board, as something that had been present in the work and had to be accounted for. What he returned to, again and again, in those rooms in Nicopolis, was not the injury. It was the moment before the injury, when the master had threatened him, and he had said, quietly, that the leg would break, and after, when it had broken, and he had said that he had told him so. The students always waited to see if that was the end of the story. It was not. The point was not that he had been indifferent to pain. The point was that the pain had arrived and departed and left him, in whatever way mattered most to him, exactly where he had been before it came. There is an idea at the center of everything Epictetus taught, and it is one of the oldest ideas in Stoic philosophy, though he gave it its sharpest and most spare expression. The idea begins with a division. On one side of the division, everything that belongs genuinely to the person sitting in the chair, thinking, choosing, attending, judging. On the other side, everything else. Reputation, health, other people's opinions, the weather on the day of a trial, the leg a master decides to break. The first side is the only side that is truly anyone's own. The second side was never really theirs to begin with. Epictetus had a word for what falls inside the division and a word for what falls outside it, and he introduced both at the very opening of the small manual his student Arian assembled from his lectures, not as preliminary ground clearing before the real philosophy began, but as the philosophy itself, stated plainly enough that a person could hold the whole of it in a single breath. Some things are up to us, he said, some things are not. The practice of a philosophical life, in his telling, consisted almost entirely in learning, over and over again, which was which, and then acting accordingly. The students in Nicopolis heard this, and most of them thought they had understood it. Most of them had not. The difficulty is not in grasping the distinction in the abstract. The difficulty is in grasping it again at the specific moment when the boundary is about to be crossed, when the thing on the outside of the division presents itself with sufficient force and familiarity that it begins to feel like something genuinely owned, genuinely at stake, genuinely part of what the person is, a man who accepts the distinction perfectly on a quiet afternoon may find at the moment his reputation is attacked in a crowded room that the theoretical clarity he had settled into has quietly dissolved. What Epictetus was teaching was not a piece of knowledge, but a practice, and practices are not learned once. The Stoic school that Epictetus belonged to had by his time been alive for roughly 4 centuries. Its founder, Zeno of Citium, had not arrived at philosophy through an inherited tradition or a distinguished teacher in a prestigious school. He had arrived through shipwreck. The story, which has the quality of something that may have been improved in the telling, but whose outline the ancient sources agree on, is that Zeno was a merchant, a trader in purple dye, whose ship went down somewhere in the Mediterranean, taking his cargo and his commercial livelihood with it. He arrived in Athens with considerably less than he had departed with. At some point not long after, in the kind of shop that sold books alongside other things, he found a copy of Xenophon's account of Socrates and read it through. He asked the bookseller where he might find men like the ones in the book. A philosopher was walking past the shop at that moment. The bookseller pointed him out. Zeno followed him. This is where the Stoic school began, not with a systematic intention to found a school, but with a man who had lost something substantial, following a stranger through the streets of Athens, because a bookseller had pointed. Zeno eventually began teaching in the covered walkway near the Athenian agora, known as the Stoa Poikela, the painted porch, whose walls carried frescoes of military victories, images of conquest and decisive battle, a strange setting for a philosophy that would spend the next several centuries arguing that the conquest of the world outside the self was not what mattered. He taught there for decades. The school that gathered around his teaching was named, with characteristic simplicity, for the place where it met, Stoics, people of the porch, what Zeno built on, what the school would carry forward through Cleanthes and Chrysippus, and eventually through Ponetitius and Posidonius and Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, was a particular insistence about the structure of the universe. The Stoics believed that reality was not a collection of unrelated events bumping against each other in a void. They believed it was suffused with reason, not reason as a human capacity projected outward, but reason as a genuine feature of the whole, a rational principle they called the logos, simultaneously the physical force that held the world together and the intelligent order through which it unfolded. Everything that happened in this account happened as it had to happen, not randomly, not accidentally, but as the expression of a rational necessity running through the whole of things. The Logos was not a god in any ordinary sense. though the Stoics sometimes used the word interchangeably with Zeus in a way that suggested they were not anxious about the distinction. It was closer to what a later vocabulary might call the rational structure of nature itself, the order that makes the world legible, the principle by which the motion of everything, including every human life, is not noise but pattern. This is the philosophical claim on which everything else in the Stoic system rested. It is a large claim, and the Stoics knew it was large. They did not hold it lightly or reach for it as a convenient consolation. They argued for it through physics, through logic, through the observation of natural processes. Chrysippus, in particular, the third head of the school, credited with systematizing what Zeno had originated, built an elaborate philosophical architecture defending the claim against every serious objection he could find, writing with the kind of industry that later philosophers found either admirable or exhausting depending on their temperament. The point was not to win an argument. The point was that if the Logos claim held, then the whole of Stoic ethical life followed from it, with a kind of necessity. If the universe is ordered by reason, then a person who understands their place within that order, who sees clearly where they stand in the whole, rather than experiencing each event as an isolated shock, can find something the Stoics called equanimity, a word that points not at pleasant feeling, but at a stable orientation, a settled relationship to the movement of things. The Stoic equanimity was not indifference. This is a misreading that the Stoics themselves worked to correct. Epictetus was not indifferent to his leg. Marcus Aurelius was not indifferent to the deaths of his children. The distinction the Stoics were drawing was more subtle and more demanding than mere indifference, and it required more of the person who tried to practice it. The argument was not that external events did not affect the person. The argument was that the person's deepest good, what they fundamentally were, what the quality of their inner life ultimately depended on, resided in a domain that external events could not touch, not because it was protected from them by some wall of numbness, but because it was genuinely and constitutively separate from them. What a person was, at the level that mattered most, was a being capable of rational choice and response. No event, however large, could make that capacity better or worse. It could only be made better or worse by the person themselves, through the choices they made in the face of what arrived. Virtue, in the Stoic account, was the name for rational capacity, exercised well, and the Stoics made a claim about virtue that separated them from nearly every other ancient school of ethics. They said it was the only thing that was unconditionally good. Not health, not wealth, not reputation, not pleasure, not long life. These things were preferred. The Stoics were not recommending poverty or illness as philosophically superior conditions, but they were preferred the way a right-handed person prefers their right hand, usefully, with a slight natural inclination, while recognizing that the loss of it would not change who they fundamentally were. The technical word for these preferred, but not fundamentally important goods was indifference, with the qualifier preferred attached to indicate that Stoicism was not counseling their deliberate rejection. The argument was subtler, that genuine good, the kind of good that constitutes a truly excellent human life, could be present or absent, regardless of whether the preferred indifference were in place. Marcus Aurelius could live a genuinely good life in a military camp on the Danube. Epictetus had lived one in slavery. The conditions were not the point. The quality of the response to the conditions was. This left the Stoics with a picture of the ethical life that was in certain respects more austere than competing ancient pictures, and in certain respects far more available. More austere because it asked a person to relinquish the ordinary claim that they could be harmed by bad fortune, that things going wrong outside them constituted a genuine injury to the good they were pursuing. More available because it removed the philosophical dependence on external goods that made other ethical systems, in practice, the inheritance of people born into good circumstances. Epictetus had been a slave. The Stoic framework he inherited and elaborated was not despite that fact, but in some sense built around it, not because slavery was philosophically acceptable or because the Stoics argued against its abolition, but because the deepest resources of a human being in the Stoic account were genuinely inaccessible to any master, however powerful. There is a third strand of Stoic thought that runs alongside the dichotomy of control and the picture of virtue, and it becomes important later in understanding what it meant for Marcus Aurelius to govern an empire as a philosophical act rather than as a political one. The Stoics had a theory of how human beings come to recognize their obligations to each other, and it was built on an observation about development rather than an abstract principle about duty. They noticed that the natural movement of a growing mind was outward, that a very young person was primarily concerned with themselves, that this concern gradually extended to family, then to community, then, in the person whose development had continued far enough, to all of rational humanity. The concept was oikeiosis, a word that does not have a clean single English equivalent, but carries the idea of recognition, of coming to perceive as one's own, of the natural affiliation that grows when genuine understanding grows. Heracles, a Stoic of the 2nd century, described it with an image: concentric circles, the self at the center, family in the next ring, community in the next, strangers on the road, in the ring beyond that, humanity itself at the outermost edge, and then the philosophical instruction to draw those outer circles inward, to practice treating the stranger as the family member, the distant person as the near one, not as a performance of magnanimity, but as a disciplined extension of the recognition that all rational beings share the same fundamental nature. For the Stoics, this was not a separate ethical principle sitting alongside the dichotomy and the virtue claim. It followed from the same root. If the logos was the rational principle sustaining all of reality, and if human beings were distinguished by their participation in that rational principle, then the rational maturation that extended moral concern outward was simply the process of becoming more fully what one already was at the deepest level. The slave in Nicopolis and the emperor in Rome shared the same rational nature. The provincial farmer in Gaul and the senator in the capital were both expressions of the same underlying logos. This was not a metaphor or a political slogan. The Stoics meant it as an accurate description of the structure of things. And from that description, civic and political obligation followed, not as an external imposition on the philosophically serious person, but as the natural expression of what philosophical seriousness, pursued far enough, actually revealed about who one was in relation to others. Epictetus had a practice for keeping this recognition alive in the conditions of ordinary life. The practice was not meditative in any elaborate sense. It was, in its structure, almost plain. Before a day began, before the encounters and obligations of the day had arrived to compete for attention, a person would sit in stillness, the stillness that exists in a room before the household wakes, in the minutes before a long day becomes what it will become, and think forward, not with dread, not rehearsing disasters, but with the specific kind of philosophical preparation that names what is likely to come before it arrives, so that none of it meets the mind as an ambush. The colleague who will be impatient, the request that will be unjust, the errand that will feel beneath the dignity of a person who has been reading philosophy, the tedious obligation with no obvious philosophical content. Epictetus recommended not merely acknowledging these in advance, but thinking through the response, deciding before the moment what a person who understood the dichotomy of control would do when the moment arrived, so that the moment itself became the execution of a decision already made, rather than an improvised scramble in conditions of pressure. This exercise had a purpose beyond efficiency. Its purpose was the one the Stoics returned to constantly, keeping the connection between abstract principle and daily action alive at the point where that connection most often frayed. Philosophical understanding, in the Stoic account, was not stable by nature. It had to be renewed. It had to be practiced the way a musician practices scales, not because the musician has forgotten how scales work, but because the body's fluency in executing them deteriorates without repetition and returns only through sustained and unglamorous work. A person who had read and understood the Stoic argument perfectly, who could reproduce it accurately and defend it against objections, would still find, the first morning they skipped the preparation, that the impatient colleague arrived like a surprise, and the surprise produced a reaction that the understood argument should have prevented. The morning practice was the gap between understanding and being. Marcus Aurelius knew this practice. He had been introduced to philosophy young by a series of teachers whose names and particular influences he recorded in the opening book of the Meditations, with the kind of careful acknowledgement that shows a person remembering debts genuinely felt rather than performing gratitude for an audience. Junius Rusticus, who gave him his copy of Epictetus's recorded lectures. Apollonius of Chalcedon, from whom he learned, as he put it, freedom and undeviating steadiness of purpose. Sextus of Chaeronea, whose household had the character of a philosophical school, even while being an ordinary working home. These teachers arrived in Marcus's life during the years of his formal education, and they introduced him to a philosophical tradition that had been developing for 400 years, a tradition that had moved, by the time it reached him, from the covered walkway in Athens through the houses of Roman aristocrats, from the lecture hall in Nicopolis to the reading lists of the imperial court. What Marcus found in Epictetus in particular, what he returned to over and over across the years of his private writing, was not a comfortable philosophy. The Enchiridion, the small manual, opened with the division between what is up to us and what is not, and it held that line with a severity that demanded genuine philosophical reckoning rather than intellectual agreement followed by comfortable life. Epictetus in his lectures was not gentle with students who wanted the theory without the practice. He had a way of asking people to describe their actual behavior on the morning before they came to his class, and of noting, with patient specificity, the gap between that behavior and the Stoic principles they had been nodding along with for an hour. The lectures were not designed to make students feel that they had understood something. They were designed to make students feel the distance between understanding and being, and to make that distance feel like something worth the effort of closing. Marcus felt the distance. The Meditations, the private Greek manuscript in which he wrote not to an audience, but against himself, in the second person imperative, for years are in many respects a record of that distance, rather than a record of its closure. The passages where he returns to Epictetus are not passages of doctrinal summary. They are passages of a practitioner who has been away from the practice, or who has found it failing under pressure, returning to the foundational text the way a craftsman returns to a set of basic cuts, not because he has forgotten what they are, but because the hand has drifted and the eye has followed, and the work requires going back. What the Stoic framework gave Marcus, what it gave Epictetus in Nicopolis, and what it had given Zeno in Athens after the shipwreck, was not a solution to the difficulty of living in difficult circumstances. It was something more modest and more useful. It gave a way of holding the difficulty that did not require the difficulty to resolve before the good life could begin. Zeno had not waited for his cargo to be restored before committing to philosophy. Epictetus had not waited for his freedom to practice equanimity. The Stoic claim was not that circumstances did not matter, or that preferences were philosophically illegitimate, or that suffering was not genuinely felt. The claim was that the good a person most fundamentally needed was not the kind of good that circumstances determined. And this claim, held as a practitioner's working assumption rather than a theoretical proposition, tried against the specific mornings and specific encounters and specific failures of an actual life, was what the Stoic practice was trying, slowly, to produce. The image Epictetus returned to, in the lectures Arrian recorded, was one of an actor in a play. The role assigned is not always the one the actor would have chosen. The play may be a long one, or a short one, a tragedy or a comedy, a part at the center or a part at the margins. None of this is up to the actor. What is up to the actor, entirely, constitutively, without exception, is how well the assigned role is played. The quality of the performance, the attention brought to it, the degree of honest effort given to making this character, in these circumstances, as fully and truly as possible what it ought to be. The Stoics did not think this image diminished human dignity. They thought it clarified it. The person who understood themselves as an actor in a cosmic drama, whose overall narrative was ordered by the Logos, was not thereby reduced to a passive receiver of events. They were freed from the exhausting and philosophically incoherent position of believing their good depended on the shape of a narrative they did not control. They could attend entirely to what was actually theirs. The morning exercise Epictetus recommended began. Then, with this understanding in place, not merely as doctrine, but as something felt, something practiced enough to be available at the moment of need, and the Logos claim grounded it. If the universe proceeded by reason, then every circumstance one encountered, however unwelcome, arrived as the only thing that could have arrived, the specific expression of a rational order one could not see the whole of, but could trust the structure of. The unwelcome colleague was not an interruption of a rational day. The unjust request was not a deviation from a smooth philosophical life. They were the material, they were the role. The practice was to meet them, not as surprises to a mind that had expected something different, but as the specific, particular, unrepeatable content of this day's exercise in rational response. Arrian, transcribing Epictetus's lectures, caught something about the quality of that teaching that the formal Stoic texts from earlier centuries do not quite carry. The earlier texts, Chrysippus's voluminous writings, almost entirely lost. Clyntie's hymn to Zeus, the fragments of Zeno, had the character of philosophical construction, of a school building, its architecture argument by argument, defending its positions against the skeptics and the Epicureans and the Peripatetics, working out the technical details of a logic and a physics and an ethics that had to hold together under sustained examination. Epictetus did not write treatises. He talked to students who were confused and resistant and sometimes dishonest about their own behavior, and he found ways of making the doctrine immediate, not by simplifying it, but by refusing to allow the gap between understanding and practice to stay comfortable. The Stoic framework, in his hands, was not a monument to be admired. It was a set of tools to be used, and tools that were not being used were for him a kind of philosophical dereliction. Marcus understood them as tools. The private manuscript in which he wrote circles back repeatedly to the same difficulties: the difficulty of rising, the difficulty of remaining patient under tedium, the difficulty of giving genuine rather than ceremonial attention to each person who arrived before him, not because he had failed to absorb the Stoic framework, but because the framework was exactly what he was using to address them incompletely on each occasion, returning to it the next morning as a practice rather than as a possession. The concentric circles Heracles described, the image of expanding moral concern drawn systematically outward from the self, were available to Marcus as an actual philosophical exercise. Sitting before the day began, in whatever tent or room the campaign had left him, he could do what the image recommended: hold the circle of himself, then extend it to the household, to the soldiers outside the tent, to the provinces sending dispatches, to the populations whose welfare passed through the decisions he would make before nightfall. The exercise was not self-aggrandizing. It was, in Stoic terms, simply an accurate description of how okiosis, the natural outward movement of rational moral concern, applied to the specific situation of a person in his position. The circles were large. In his case, the practice of drawing them inward required more sustained effort than it required of most people, but the structure of the exercise was identical to what Epictetus had recommended to his students in Nicopolis, the former slaves, and the wealthy young men, and the older ones who had arrived late to philosophy and were trying to make up lost time. The logos, the dichotomy of control, the virtue claim, the preferred indifference, oikeiosis, the morning preparation, the evening review, these were not separate philosophical technologies assembled from different sources and combined for personal convenience. In the Stoic account, they formed a single coherent picture. The physics grounded the ethics. The ethics required the practice. The practice was intelligible only against the physics. A person who understood the logos had a reason to believe in the dichotomy of control that was not merely a consolation, but a metaphysical claim, an account of the actual structure of things. A person who understood the dichotomy had a reason to take virtue seriously that was not merely conventional, but rational, a recognition of where genuine good actually resided. A person who understood virtue as the only unconditional good had a reason to expand moral concern outward through oikeiosis that was not merely sentimental, but philosophical, the natural expression of what rational maturation actually produced. And a person who understood all of this, even partially, even imperfectly, even returning to the understanding on mornings after it had been lost, had a reason to practice that was not external compulsion, but internal recognition. Zeno had followed a stranger through the streets of Athens because a bookseller had pointed. He could not have known in that moment where the following would lead. He had lost his cargo and his livelihood, and found himself in a foreign city with a copy of Xenophon in his hand, and something in what he had read had moved him toward the stranger rather than away. The Stoic school that eventually grew from that following spent 6 centuries working out the implications of what Zeno had begun to find in those first encounters with Socratic philosophy, not in a straight line, not without significant internal argument, not without the losses and reconstructions that any school sustained across centuries will accumulate, but with a remarkable consistency of core commitment. The Logos ordered things. The good resided in rational response to what arrived. The practice of keeping that recognition alive, daily before the day began and after it had ended, was the philosophical life in its most essential form. Marcus, reading Epictetus in a military encampment, was 6 centuries from the Stoa Poikile. The frescoes on the walls of the painted porch were gone or faded by then. The school Zeno had founded had spread across the Mediterranean world, had shaped Roman philosophy and Roman governance and Roman legal thought, had produced Seneca's letters and Epictetus's lectures, and would produce Marcus's own private manuscript. But what Marcus was doing in the early hours before the camp woke was the same exercise Zeno had done in Athens and Epictetus had done in Nicopolis, returning, in a moment of stillness, to the recognition that what was genuinely his was small and specific and inalienable, and that within that small specific domain, the quality of response was everything, and that if the universe proceeded by reason, then this moment, this particular morning, this particular set of difficulties arriving on the day's first dispatches was not an obstacle to a philosophical life, but the exact and only material a philosophical life could ever be made from. The logos in Marcus's working understanding was not a theological comfort. It was a practitioner's assumption that reason runs through things, and that meeting what arrives with the quality of rational attention one is capable of is not only the best a person can do, but in some sense that the whole Stoic tradition had been elaborating for 4 centuries. The only thing a person was ever really being asked to do. Before the camp had risen, before the dispatches arrived. In the particular stillness that existed between the end of one day's work and the beginning of the next, the assumption held, the practice continued. The morning and everything it would require had not yet begun. On an evening sometime during the years of the Marcomannic Wars, Marcus Aurelius set down a military dispatch he had just signed and reached for something else. The dispatch was written in Latin, the language of orders, of territorial claims, of the administrative machine that kept 5 million square kilometers of civilization from dissolving into its own contradictions. What he reached for instead was a Greek manuscript, small and private, carried with him from encampment to encampment, the way another man might carry a letter from someone he loved. He did not open it to read, he opened it to write, and what he wrote was not for anyone who would ever read it. The tent around him would have smelled of wood smoke and damp wool, and the particular staleness of a space that has been lived in through cold weather by a man too busy to properly air it. Outside, the sounds of a frontier army settling into evening, the distant calls of sentries, the low conversation of men who had spent the day on the edge of violence and were now eating and remembering they were still alive. Marcus sat inside all of that and began to examine what the day had done to him, not what he had done to the day, what the day had done to him. This is the first thing to understand about the Meditations as a document. It runs in that direction, inward and corrective, and almost entirely concerned with failure. Not military failure or administrative failure, though he was managing both simultaneously in those years, but the smaller and more persistent failures of attention and patience and equanimity. The places where the Stoic discipline he had been cultivating for decades had frayed under the ordinary pressure of a long and difficult day. He wrote in the second person, addressing himself the way a teacher addresses a student who has not yet understood something important, except that the teacher and the student were the same person, and the lesson was one he had already heard many times. The manuscript would never be edited. It would never be shown to another person. It contains no explanation of itself, no introduction, no narrative arc that carries the reader from one point to another. It is entries across years, circling the same problems, returning to the same philosophical commands, the voice of a man who has caught himself failing the same test again, and has decided that the honest response to this is not shame, but renewed attention. There is a passage in which he tells himself to stop talking about what a good man ought to be and simply be one. The directness of it is almost startling. There is no cushioning, no philosophical scaffolding erected around the rebuke. He had been talking. He needed to stop talking and do the thing. He wrote this down, alone in Greek, in a military camp on the edge of the Roman world, because writing it down was the closest thing he had found to actually believing it. The Stoics had developed a practice of daily philosophical reflection that served two distinct purposes. In the morning, before the day had arrived with its particular texture of irritants and obligations, a practitioner would sit in stillness and rehearse the difficulties ahead, not with dread, with preparation, the impatient colleague who would need to be answered with more patience than he deserved. The bureaucratic obligation so tedious that attention would keep sliding away from it toward anything else. The moment in a judicial hearing when the temptation to decide quickly and move on would compete with the obligation to decide carefully and stay. Each of these anticipated in advance, named, stripped of their power to arrive as surprises. In the evening, the same practitioner would return to the day that had actually happened and assess it, not to condemn, but to know, to see with more precision where the discipline had held and where it had not, so that tomorrow there would be slightly more to work with than there had been today. Marcus inherited this practice and used it, and the meditations are in large part the written record of his evening review. Not a journal of what happened, a journal of where he stood in relation to what happened and where he had wanted to stand, and the gap between those two positions that kept demanding his attention. The gap is what gives the document its particular quality of honesty. If he had written about philosophical achievement, about the Stoic principles applied cleanly, and the equanimity maintained without effort, the document would be a different kind of thing entirely. It would be the kind of thing that is useful to read once and then put down. Instead, he wrote about the gap and kept writing about the same gap, and the document is therefore inexhaustible in a way that philosophical treatises rarely are. It does not teach, it shows, and what it shows is a practice in motion, imperfect, ongoing, belonging to someone who understood that philosophy was not a subject one finished studying, but a direction one continuously tried to face. There is a passage he returned to across several of the Meditations entries, appearing in slightly different forms, as though he had not quite found the right version yet, and kept trying again. The command to rise, to get up from sleep and attend to the obligations of the day, rather than lingering in the warmth and ease of not yet. The way he wrote about this particular struggle has a specificity that feels almost uncomfortably intimate. He imagined the counter-argument his own mind made, that staying a little longer was not laziness, but rest, that the body needed what it was asking for, that the philosophical case for rising could wait another hour. And then he wrote the rebuttal, not with severity, but with the kind of quiet insistence that has run out of patience for the same excuse. Rising to meet the day's obligations was itself the philosophical act. The argument inside the blankets was where the Stoic practice either held or it did not. This particular struggle, so small in comparison to the administrative weight of the Roman Empire, so private in comparison to the military campaigns he was simultaneously directing, says something important about the texture of what he was doing with the Meditations. He could have written about the Marcomannic Wars. He had material enough. He could have written about the plague, the administrative correspondence, the legal appeals, the weight of decisions whose consequences reached across populations he would never see. Instead, he kept coming back to the small defeats, the morning he had not wanted to get up, the afternoon when patience had run out faster than it should have, the moment in a conversation when he had noticed himself performing equanimity rather than practicing it. These were the entries he needed to write, because these were the places where the philosophy lived or died. The grand tests, the historically visible tests, arrived already framed by their own gravity. The small tests arrived in the ordinary gaps of an ordinary day, unannounced, disguised as nothing in particular, and those were the ones he kept failing. The physical manuscript itself, imagined as it must have actually existed before the hands of Byzantine copyists gave it its durable form, would have had the quality of work done in the margins of other work, passages written quickly, in the handwriting of a man who had been doing something else and had set it down to reach for this. Other passages written more slowly, late in an evening, the sentences longer, the arguments developing across more space, as though the day had finally slowed enough to allow genuine thinking rather than urgent thinking. The transitions between entries would not have been clean. There would have been days with nothing, and then a return, and the return would carry the particular tone of someone who has been interrupted for weeks by exactly the kind of thing the philosophy was supposed to help him manage, and who has come back to the manuscript to say so. What Marcus was doing in those private hours runs deeper than the simple keeping of a journal. He was conducting a practice that his philosophical tradition called prosoche, a continuous self-attention, a watching of one's own mind, not with the suspicious anxiety of someone looking for wrongdoing, but with the patient clarity of someone who simply wants to know what is actually happening inside. The Stoic understanding was that most human suffering does not arise from external circumstances, but from the judgments made about those circumstances, and that the judgments, unlike the circumstances themselves, are available to deliberate examination and change. This meant that the quality of one's inner life was never fixed by events. It was fixed only by the degree of attention one brought to one's own responses to events. Marcus had understood this intellectually for most of his adult life. The meditations are the record of what it cost to understand it practically, day after day, across years of conditions that were not remotely designed to make the practice easy. There is a kind of fatigue in some of the entries that is hard to misread. Not philosophical fatigue, not a sense that the ideas have run dry or that the doctrine has stopped being convincing. Something more like the tiredness of a long-distance runner who is far enough into the race that the beginning is not available as a reference point and the end is not yet visible, and who has to find the motivation for the next step somewhere inside the step itself rather than in either direction of the course. Marcus had been managing the empire since 161 CE. By the time of the most difficult Danubian campaigns, he was in his late 40s, which is not old but is the age at which the compound weight of continuous obligation begins to leave its particular mark. The passages in the meditations that urge him to attend to the present moment, to be here rather than in the imagination of a different life, carry a quietness that suggests the imagined different life was genuinely vivid. He knew exactly what he was forgoing. He wrote about it with neither bitterness nor self-pity, but he wrote about it, which means the longing was real, and the philosophical response to it was a daily practice rather than a single settled conclusion. On an evening like the one that opens this picture of him, after the dispatch was set aside and the manuscript opened, he might have written something about patience. He returned to patience with a frequency that suggests it was his most consistent practical difficulty, not impatience of the theatrical kind, the snapping and the raised voice, but the more subtle failure of attention that looks like equanimity from the outside and is actually a kind of managed distance. He wrote about the obligation to actually attend to the person in front of him, to bring genuine rather than performed presence to the bureaucratic appeal, the senator's complaint, the soldier's grievance, the report from a provincial governor describing a flood or a crop failure or a localized violence that needed a response from the center. The center was him. The response was whatever he brought to the moment. And what he brought to the moment depended entirely on what he had done with the moments before, including the moment before dawn, when he had argued with himself about getting up. The Stoic daily review was not designed to be a comfortable experience. The point of it was not reassurance. The point was accuracy, knowing where one had actually stood, rather than where one had imagined oneself standing, so that the gap between aspiration and practice could be addressed with something more useful than vague self-disappointment. Marcus used the manuscript for this precision. He wrote about specific failures with the kind of specificity that is only possible when the failure is recent and the memory of it is still uncomfortable. The philosophical vocabulary he used did not soften the examination, it structured it. Where had the judgment been unclear? Where had the desire extended itself into the domain of things outside one's control? Where had the duty been performed, but performed without the quality of attention that would have made it genuine? These were not abstract questions, they had answers. The answers were visible in the record of the day he had just finished. He wrote them down. There is a particular entry in which Marcus observed that it was possible to retire into oneself at any moment, that the mind, properly understood, was a place of withdrawal available regardless of external circumstance, a country house always accessible, requiring no journey and no appointment, only the decision to turn inward. This image appears more than once in the meditations, offered with the genuine warmth of a consolation he had found useful, but there is something in the repetition of it that reveals its limit. A consolation found useful enough to need returning to is also a consolation that has not entirely resolved the thing it was consoling. The country house of the mind was real, and Marcus returned to it regularly, and it helped him. The actual country house, the actual philosophical leisure of a man free to read and think, without the weight of empire pressing on every hour, was something he had not had, and knew he would not have. He wrote about the interior version with genuine gratitude. The repetition with which he wrote about it also suggests that he knew the difference. During the worst of the Danubian campaigns, when the military situation was most demanding and the administrative pressures were compounding each other in the way that crises do, not sequentially, but simultaneously, arriving in clusters, each one requiring a quality of attention that should have been spread across a week, Marcus continued to find the time to write. Not long entries always, and not every evening, but the manuscript kept accumulating. This is itself a fact worth sitting with. A man managing what he was managing, who had not slept enough, and whose body was aging in the particular way that Northern European campaigning aged bodies, who had more dispatches on his desk than hours in his day. This man kept returning to the private Greek manuscript to ask himself how he had done, not whether the campaign had gone well, how he had done, whether the philosophical discipline had been present in the room when it was needed, whether the inner life had matched, however approximately, the outer performance. This was the examination he considered worth conducting, even when time was short, especially when time was short, perhaps, because when time was short was when the discipline was most at risk of being quietly set aside. The meditations contain very little that is conventionally moving in the way that personal documents are often moving, and that there is no direct grief recorded, no named moment of loss, treated with the emotional weight that the losses Marcus sustained might have seemed to warrant. He lost children, several, across the years of his reign, a recurring fact of his life that the document does not address frontally. What the document contains instead is the philosophical framework through which he was trying to hold himself together, and the repeated evidence of what it cost to apply that framework to actual conditions. The Stoic distinction between feeling the emotion and being governed by the emotion was not a command to become unfeeling, it was a command to feel without losing the capacity to continue. Marcus applied this distinction not in grand recorded moments, but in the ordinary, ongoing texture of daily practice, and the meditations are full of the evidence of its application, the steering back toward duty, the reorientation toward the present moment, the command to himself to attend to what is actually here rather than to what is feared or mourned or desired. There is a quality to his philosophical self-examination that feels different from most ancient philosophical writing, and the difference is in the direction the examination runs. Most ancient philosophy that has survived was written for an audience, and this means it was written with the particular care of someone who knows they are being observed and has arranged themselves accordingly. The argument is constructed to be persuasive. The self-presentation is managed. Even when ancient writers described their own doubts or failures, the description was shaped by its rhetorical function, what the writer wanted the reader to understand or feel. Marcus's document removes this layer entirely. The absence of an audience did not make the writing careless. It made it accurate in a way that is almost impossible to achieve when even a hypothetical reader is present. He wrote what was actually happening because there was no one to impress with a different account. The second person address, the you directed at himself, commanding and correcting, gives the entries a quality that is difficult to describe with complete precision. It is not the voice of a man performing philosophy. It is the voice of a man trying to catch himself before the performance instinct takes over, insisting that what happens in this private hour be genuine rather than curated. He wrote to himself the way a serious practitioner of anything writes in the private record of their practice, with the particular honesty that is only possible when the record serves the practice rather than the other way around. The practice did not exist to produce the record. The record existed to sharpen the practice. Every entry was the instrument of the next day's attention, not a monument to the day that had just passed. Somewhere in the middle of the years when the meditations were being written, a reader can sense a slight shift in the entries, not a change of conviction or doctrine, a change of register. The urgency that marks some of the earlier passages, the feeling of a man still arguing himself into a philosophical position he has not yet fully inhabited, gives way to something quieter and more settled, which is not the quietness of a man who has finished the work, but the quietness of a man who has understood that the work does not finish, that the same passages will need to be written again tomorrow, that the same commands will need to be given to himself in the same pre-dawn stillness, that the practice is not moving toward a state of completion from which the practice will no longer be necessary. It is the state, it is the life. The philosophy was not a preparation for how he was going to live, it was how he was living, documented in the intervals between the living itself. On one of those evenings on the Danubian frontier, Marcus would have set the manuscript down at some point and looked up from it into whatever darkness was available to him, the space of the tent, the low glow of the oil lamp, the sounds of the encampment outside continuing their particular evening pattern. The dispatch he had signed earlier was somewhere else now, already in the hands of whoever needed to carry it forward. The decisions he had made in the judicial hearing that afternoon were already fixed, already unalterable, already out in the world doing whatever they were going to do. What remained was this hour, the manuscript, the attention he was still capable of bringing to the examination of the day that was now finished. He would have reached for the practice the way he reached for it every evening, not as an escape from what the day had been, but as the most direct possible engagement with it, the refusal to let the day pass without knowing what had happened inside it. The passages of the meditations concerned with the present moment return with a frequency that suggests this was the central practical challenge of Marcus's philosophical life. Not the grand philosophical questions about the nature of the logos or the cosmological arguments for why virtue should be chosen over pleasure. Those were settled in his understanding and did not require repeated urging. What required repeated urging was the specific, daily, entirely ordinary discipline of being here rather than elsewhere, attending to this conversation rather than the imagined other life, bringing genuine presence to this judicial appeal rather than the managed performance of presence, treating this soldier's grievance as the thing that deserved his attention right now, rather than as one item among the many competing for a finite hour. Each of these was a test, not a dramatic test, a quiet one, and quiet tests, he understood, were where the philosophy actually lived. In the last light of an evening, sometime in those years, finishing an entry that had started from the familiar place of self-correction and found its way towards something slightly more open, the recognition returned to again and again that attention itself was the practice, that the direction of genuine engagement with the present moment was the whole of what he was trying to do. Marcus would have set down the manuscript and sat for a moment in the particular stillness of a man who has just written something he already knew and needed to write anyway. Outside, the encampment settling further into the night, the oil lamp steady in the stillness of the tent. The day behind him now, examined and recorded and set down in its proper place. Tomorrow still somewhere ahead, gathering its particular quality of difficulty and obligation, and the small repeated tests that would need to be met again with whatever the practice had made available. He would reach for the lamp eventually. The entry was finished. The examination was what it was, as honest as he could make it, which was the only measure he was working with, the only measure he had ever used. The manuscript would be carried forward into whatever the next encampment brought, and then the next, and then the one after that. The practice would continue, not because the difficulty was decreasing, but because the practice itself was the answer to the difficulty. The only answer he had found that actually worked. When the day closed in, and the philosophy was required to function under conditions that philosophy in comfortable rooms had not anticipated and could not fully prepare for. The command to be present, not the grand philosophical command toward cosmic acceptance, but the simple practical instruction to attend fully to what is here right now, was the one he returned to most. Not because he had not understood it, because understanding it and doing it were two entirely different distances, and the distance between them required the same walking every single day. The manuscript was how he kept his footing on that ground. The writing was the practice, or it was as close to the practice as writing could get. The daily record of a mind watching itself move through the difficulty of an actual life, correcting course with whatever patience remained, choosing the direction of attention again and again, in the particular way that all genuine choosing happens, not once and not finally, but in the small repeated ordinary hours that constitute a life when it is examined honestly from the inside. The oil lamp held its light in the stillness of the tent. The manuscript sat closed now, the entry finished. Outside, the frontier night continued its particular dark. the sounds of sentries and sleeping soldiers, and the distant, unsettled world that pressed against the empire's edge. And somewhere in that quiet, in the interval between the day's last obligation and the morning's first, the practice rested, not complete, never complete, but present, held in the small warmth of a lamp still burning, a page still carrying its words forward into a darkness that had not yet become morning. In the Meditations, there is a passage that reads like an argument Marcus was having with himself before he had fully risen from his blankets. He imagines the objection his own mind offers against getting up. The bed is warm, the day will be long. The obligation to begin again is nothing more than the same obligation that was there yesterday and will be there again tomorrow. And what difference does this particular morning make in the long machinery of it? The argument is not rhetorical. It has the quality of something genuinely felt, a real resistance from a real person who has been awake long enough to know what the day will ask of him. And then, within the same passage, he answers it, not with inspiration, not with the elevated claim that duty is its own reward, and the Stoic rises gladly. He answers it with the quieter, less comfortable observation that he was not made for the warmth of blankets, that to stay is to fall short of what his nature requires, that the plant does not resist the light because the light demands effort. He answers the argument, turns it over, sets it down, and presumably gets up, because the passage exists, which means he was at some point at his desk, rather than still in bed. The campaign morning he was writing from was somewhere along the Danube frontier. The year was deep into the Marcomannic Wars. Outside the tent, the sounds of an army settling into its pre-dawn routine would already have been audible, fires being stirred, horses moved, the muted work of men preparing for another day at the edge of the empire's reach. Marcus had already been at war for years by that point. He would continue for years more, and he was writing in the private Greek manuscript he never prepared for any reader about whether to get out of bed. The smallness of that gap between the man responsible for the military defense of the known world and the man who needed to argue himself out of his blankets is not accidental. It is, in fact, the gap that the entire private record holds open, because what becomes clear, reading across the years of what he wrote, is that Marcus Aurelius did not find governance natural or satisfying in the way that ambitious men find it satisfying. He did not carry authority the way men born to power tend to carry it, with an ease that makes the weight invisible because it was never felt as weight. He felt the weight. He wrote about it honestly, and what he wrote reveals a person who had to choose, with genuine philosophical deliberateness, to stay in the life his circumstances had assigned him, when another life, quieter, more contemplative, less consumed by the needs of millions, was something he had a name for and returned to wistfully across the years of his private writing. What he called it was the retreat into oneself. He described the mind as a country house to which one could withdraw at any moment, independent of external circumstance, a place of inward quiet, available even inside a military encampment, even during a judicial session. Be grave. Even in the middle of the kind of administrative correspondence that fills an emperor's days with the accumulated needs of an empire stretching from Britain to the borders of Persia. The image is genuine. He meant it as a real philosophical resource, and by every account he used it. The moments of inward gathering that the Meditations record, the practice of returning to first principles before responding rather than reacting, the deliberate pause between the event and the response that constituted the core Stoic practice as he understood and applied it. But it is worth holding the image for what it also reveals. The country house of the mind is a retreat, and you do not build retreats unless the place you are living in requires escape from. The warmth with which he described it tells the quiet truth about the coldness of the life around it. Seneca had worried at this same tension in his letters to Lucilius, decades before Marcus was born. He was trying, in those letters, to work out when philosophical withdrawal from public life was justified and when it was a form of abdication dressed in philosophical language. He was not a disinterested analyst. He had served Nero, had watched that service corrode, had eventually been forced out of public life, and then ordered to die. His conclusions were not reached in comfort. What he arrived at, not as a final settled answer, but as the best case he could make, was that retirement from public engagement is genuinely available only to a person for whom public engagement has become genuinely impossible, not merely difficult, not merely distasteful, not merely less appealing than the alternatives. The distinction between impossible and uncomfortable runs through his letters with the persistence of something he was not entirely sure about. He had experienced both and knew they were not the same, but the line between them was harder to draw in practice than in argument. Marcus never directly addressed Seneca's argument in writing. He did not need to. The continued fact of his governance was itself the answer, not the theoretical answer, but the enacted one, the kind of answer that is made not with words, but with the accumulated decisions of nearly 2 decades. The philosophical concept that gave Marcus's continued service its internal architecture was one the Stoics called appropriate action, the specific duty that belongs to a person given their actual circumstances, their actual relationships, and their actual capacities, rather than the duty that would belong to some idealized version of themselves in ideal conditions. The argument is deceptively modest. It does not say that one ought to perform some universal heroic action. It says that one ought to perform the specific action that is actually available, actually needed, and actually within one's reach, given the particular configuration of the real world in which one happens to be standing. For a philosopher who happened also to be an emperor, governing an empire of 50 million people during a period of plague and war, the specific appropriate action was not philosophical retirement. The philosophical framework itself, applied honestly, ruled it out. Not because emperors cannot be philosophers, but because a person who genuinely understands the expansion of moral concern from self to family to community to all of humanity, and who simultaneously holds in his hands the administrative authority through which the welfare of all those communities is substantially determined, cannot in philosophical honesty describe withdrawal as neutral. The Stoic framework made the obligation visible. It did not make it easier. It simply made it impossible to look away from. He had lost children. The number was 8, at least, of the 14 born to him and Faustina. The Meditations do not speak of this directly. The grief appears in the white spaces rather than the written lines, in the passages whose tone has shifted slightly from the passages before them, in the places where the handwriting suggests interruption and return, in the way certain themes recur with a quality that belongs not to philosophical repetition, but to something more urgent, pushing beneath it. What he did write, across those years of accumulating loss, was the philosophical argument for the distinction between feeling grief and being governed by it. The Stoics did not claim that a person of philosophical discipline does not feel the death of a child. They claimed, and this is the subtle and demanding part, that the person of philosophical discipline feels it without the feeling becoming the organizing principle of what follows. The grief is real, the duty remains. The appropriate action does not change because the person performing it is in pain. Marcus wrote this out in various forms across the years. The evidence that he was writing about something lived rather than something theoretical is in the frequency with which he returned to it. A person who has genuinely resolved a philosophical problem stops needing to write it again and again. The repetition in the meditations is the repetition of practice, not of settled conclusion. What makes this remarkable, and the word is used here not for emphasis, but because the fact genuinely resists any smaller term, is not the loss itself, but the response to it, not the Stoic response in the popular sense, which implies numbness or suppression. The philosophical response, which is the attempt to remain present and functional, and genuinely attentive to the needs of others, while carrying what grief demands to be carried. The argument running beneath the surface of the meditations is that these two things are not incompatible, that a person can be someone to whom terrible things happen, and also someone who continues to perform their obligations with the quality of attention those obligations deserve. That the philosophical life is not a life protected from loss, but a life in which loss does not become the final word. Marcus was making this argument in writing across decades for an audience of one in the specific conditions of a military campaign. The argument is not abstract. Every word of it was earned. There is a passage in the Meditations where he addresses himself on the subject of people who have frustrated him, courtiers who flatter, colleagues who act from vanity, advisors who have not told him the truth. He reminds himself in the second person, as he almost always does, that these people are also rational beings, also part of the same whole, also performing their appropriate actions as best they understand them. And then he adds something that has the quality of genuine practical wisdom rather than philosophical doctrine, that when he wakes in the morning, he has already anticipated meeting these people, has already rehearsed his response to them, has already set his mind in the direction of the day rather than against it, so that none of them arrive as surprises to a person caught without preparation. The philosophical morning practice, the mental rehearsal of difficulty before difficulty arrives, was not, for Marcus, a technique borrowed from a manual. It was the specific instrument through which the philosophical principles were kept alive inside the conditions of an imperial life that had very little patience for the contemplative pace philosophy prefers, because governing was not, for Marcus, a sequence of elevated decisions made by a serene philosopher emperor above the everyday. It was petitions, it was legal appeals from provincial subjects whose cases were complex and whose grievances were real. It was military dispatches arriving in the middle of the night from commanders on frontiers he could not personally inspect. It was the administration of grain supplies during plague years, the management of senatorial relationships that required the particular kind of attention that keeps a powerful room from becoming adversarial, the daily work of a judicial system in which his was often the last court of appeal, the Stoic concept of appropriate action, the specific duty that belongs to the specific person in their specific circumstances, had for Marcus a very literal application. The circumstances were the empire. The appropriate action was to govern it well, not once but continuously, day by day, morning after morning, for nearly 2 decades. The philosophical question of why he stayed is answered, at one level, by the observation that the framework he had most deeply internalized made leaving philosophically incoherent. But the more honest answer, the one the Meditations actually shows, rather than simply states, is that he stayed because each morning he chose to, and the philosophical apparatus was the instrument that made choosing possible when the inclination ran the other way. There is a particular quality to repeated voluntary choice that differs from both compulsion and habit. Compulsion leaves no space between the pressure and the action. Habit leaves space, but fills it automatically. Voluntary choice requires the space to remain genuinely open. The possibility of refusal must be real for the choice to count as choice. What the morning struggle Marcus wrote about demonstrates is precisely that the space was open. He could have stayed in bed. He had the power of an emperor and the philosophical standing to construct an argument for contemplative withdrawal that would have survived scrutiny. The Stoics themselves had considered the case for philosophical retirement and found it valid under specific conditions. Marcus could have found his conditions sufficiently specific. He chose not to, and he chose not to. He chose not to, each morning, across years, in a way that required the choice to be made again, each time, rather than inherited from the previous morning's decision. The philosophical life, as he practiced it, was not a decision made once and carried forward by momentum. It was the daily re-election of the same direction, requiring each time the same act of will, wearing the same grooves deeper with each return. The Stoic account of what human beings are, at their deepest level, is an account of rational beings whose nature expands outward naturally, from care for oneself to care for one's family, from care for one's family to care for one's community, from community to the wider human world. The expansion is not merely encouraged. The Stoics argued that it is what rational maturation actually looks like, that the failure to expand is a kind of arrested development, and that the person whose concern genuinely reaches the horizon of their rational capacity is also the person performing the most fully human life available. For Marcus, standing where he stood, the expansion had a very concrete ceiling. The outermost circle of moral concern, all of humanity, and the outermost circle of administrative reach, the Roman Empire, were not for him metaphors in different registers. They overlapped. The abstract philosophical instruction to care for all rational beings had, in his specific case, actual institutional weight. The welfare of the frontier populations being defended by the armies he commanded, the welfare of the provincial subjects whose legal appeals reached his desk, the welfare of the urban poor whose grain supply was maintained by imperial logistics during plague years. These were not the objects of abstract Stoic concern for some idealized universal reason. They were the people his decisions affected, immediately and materially, every day. The philosophical framework and the practical reality were for Marcus pointing at the same thing, which did not make it easy. The meditations are consistent on this point. Ease does not appear as a feature of his philosophical life. What appears, recurring in different forms across different years, is the argument for continuing in the absence of ease, the case for performing the appropriate action, not when it is natural and not when it produces satisfaction, but when neither of those things is true, on the grounds that the action is appropriate regardless. He came back to Antoninus Pius, his adoptive father and predecessor, as a model of what this looked like from the outside, a man of patient governance, unhurried in judgment, neither inflated by ceremony nor diminished by the tedium that governance necessarily contains. Antoninus appears in the Meditations as a man who had mastered the art of governing without being consumed by it, who had found a way to perform the role without becoming the role, who had remained recognizably himself inside the public identity that emperors tend to disappear into. Marcus returned to him the way a practitioner returns to a model they have not yet fully matched, with admiration that has the particular quality of recognition rather than distance, as though the qualities being admired are understood from the inside, even when they are not yet fully embodied. The contrast with Commodus, his own son and successor, does not appear in the Meditations because Commodus was still alive when Marcus was writing, and the future Marcus could not see was not something he wrote about. But the contrast that runs through the Meditations is between the kind of governance that takes its bearings from Stoic self-examination and the kind that takes its bearings from appetite and the desire for approval. And Marcus returned to the dangers of the latter with the frequency of someone genuinely worried about it in himself. He was not worried about Commodus. He was worried about the same corruption in his own character that the Stoics had always identified as the primary hazard of power: the atrophy of honest self-assessment, the slow replacement of genuine inquiry with the comfortable assumption that one's position confirms one's wisdom, the particular way that the flattery of courtiers and the ceremony of imperial life work together to replace the hard work of philosophical self-examination with a smoother, more comfortable, and entirely false substitute. The Meditations were, among other things, the instrument by which he refused that substitution, the private record of a man who would not allow the public performance of authority to become the whole of what he was. This is the practical function the private manuscript served: not to record achievements, not to demonstrate philosophical mastery, to maintain, against the constant pressure of an imperial life that had no natural place for philosophical honesty, the discipline of looking at himself clearly. He commanded himself to stop performing virtue and simply enact it. He noted his recurring failures with the specific flatness of a person who has been keeping an honest account rather than a flattering one. He returned to the same philosophical difficulties across years, which the text quietly reveals without ever announcing: the repeated instruction to himself to bear the tedious person without contempt, to manage the difficult colleague without superiority, to perform the routine obligation with the same quality of attention given to the consequential one. These are not the notes of a man who found his philosophical practice easy. They are the notes of a man who found it necessary, which is a different and more demanding thing. And through all of it, through the plague years, through the campaigns, through the legal sessions and the dispatches, and the administrative weight of an empire whose complexity required daily attention, the question of why he stayed kept resolving itself not into a single answer, but into a practice. The philosophical argument for service was something he could have stated once and moved on from. What the Meditations record is not the argument stated once, but the argument lived through continuously in the specific forms that each day's particular difficulties required. The appropriate action on a given morning was not an abstract principle, but an actual decision about an actual situation, and the philosophical discipline was not the knowledge of the principle, but the capacity to apply it to the situation with the specific quality of attention the situation deserved. What Marcus had that the philosophical argument alone could not have produced was the practice itself, the morning preparation and the evening review, the inward gathering before responding, the return to the manuscript when the day had been difficult, and the private accounting of where the principle had held and where it had slipped. These were not ornaments on the philosophical life. They were the philosophical life as he understood and practiced it, not a body of conclusions reached and held, but a direction continuously chosen and continuously maintained, requiring constant renewal because the conditions that made it difficult were constant too. There is something in the Meditations recurring more often than any other single instruction that reads like a compass bearing rather than a philosophical claim. He wrote it in various formulations, but the center of it is always the same: be here, in this, now, not yesterday's difficulty or tomorrow's obligation. This situation, this person, this moment of decision given the full attention it deserves, rather than the fractional attention left over after everything else has taken its share. The instruction is not glamorous. It does not ask for elevation or philosophical heroism. It asks for presence, the specific quality of being actually in one's life, rather than elsewhere from it, performing the immediate obligation as though it matters, because the Stoic argument runs, it does, not because this particular legal appeal or this particular dispatch will determine the fate of empires, but because the quality of attention brought to it is the quality of attention one is practicing, and the practice is what one becomes. The country house of the mind was not, in the end, a substitute for the life Marcus was actually living. It was the instrument through which he remained inhabitable inside that life. The retreat inward was not the destination. It was the return, the gathering of resources before returning to the frontier, the philosophical quiet before the next dispatch arrived, the morning stillness before the day required him to be emperor again. What he found in the retreat was not escape, but renewal, and what renewal made possible was not the absence of difficulty, but the continued capacity to meet it, morning after morning, campaign after campaign, year after year, with the same direction, the same practice, the same choosing to be present to what his rational nature and his actual circumstances together required. The meaning in this is not obvious from outside it. A man who governed under duress, who would have preferred contemplative quiet, who chose governance because his philosophical framework left no honest alternative. This is not the story of philosophical fulfillment in the sense that fulfillment is commonly understood. It is the story of philosophical integrity, which is the closer and less comfortable thing. Fulfillment suggests arrival. Integrity suggests maintenance. And what the meditations record, across their unedited years, is maintenance, the daily work of keeping the philosophical direction genuinely operative inside a life that pressed against it from every side. He chose to stay. He chose it each morning in the small and unglamorous way that the only real choices are ever made. Not in the grand declaration, but in the turning toward the day, the picking up of the manuscript before the dispatches arrived, the gathering of the mind before the mind was needed by others. Each choosing made the next one slightly more practiced, and not one whit easier, because the ease was never the point. The point was the choosing itself, repeated until it took on the quality of a life, rather than a series of separate decisions, a life built not from inspiration or natural gift, but from the disciplined daily re-election of a philosophical direction that the person living it genuinely believed was the only one available to a rational being who understood their circumstances clearly. Outside the tent, another morning was already beginning to make itself known in the slow graying of the eastern sky above the Danube. The fires would be stirred, the dispatches would arrive, the day's obligations would assemble with the unhurried patience of things that have nowhere else to be. Marcus would have been at his manuscript already, or would be shortly, not because the morning demanded it, but because the practice did, and the practice was what he had, instead of ease, and what he had found, over years of honest use, was that it was enough, not comfortable, not free from loss or weariness, or the particular loneliness of a person whose inner life is not available to the people around them. Enough, in the precise philosophical sense, sufficient for the purpose, adequate to the life, equal to what the day required when the day required it. He would rise. He had already chosen. The choice, as it always was the thing he rose into, not a state to be possessed, but a direction to be faced, morning after morning, for as many mornings as remained. Marcus, in the last years of the Marcomannic Wars, returned again and again in his private writing to the same list, the names of emperors: Augustus, Tiberius, Hadrian, Antoninus. He wrote them out not as a memorial or a celebration, but as a form of philosophical attention, a deliberate reminder that men who had held the same office, who had sat at the same kind of desk and issued the same kind of orders and believed, as emperors tend to believe, that the weight of their presence was holding something important in place. All of them were now gone, and the world had continued. The pen, moving through those names, was unhurried. He had written them before. He would write them again. And each time, the effect was not despair, but something closer to clarification, a quiet settling of what actually mattered in the hours that remained before the next dispatch arrived. The exercise was practical before it was philosophical. Marcus was not performing humility by reminding himself of his own mortality. He was using mortality as a lens, holding it up to the day ahead, so that what was trivial became easier to see as trivial, and what was genuinely worth attention became easier to recognize as such. The emperors who had preceded him had not, most of them, done this kind of looking. Some had been capable, and some had been cruel, and some had been neither particularly, drifting through the years of their office on momentum and ceremony and the institutional inertia of a very large machine. Marcus had watched that drift from close proximity across his entire life, had seen what it looked like when a man of great power stopped asking hard questions about how he was using it, and he had formed in himself a deep resistance to that particular kind of forgetting. The resistance required maintenance. It required, in fact, daily maintenance in writing by a man who could not be certain that what he wrote today would still feel true tomorrow. This is the quality that makes the Meditations different from almost anything else that survives from the ancient world. Not its doctrine, which is Stoic in its main lines, and would have been recognizable to any educated Roman of the period. Not its style, which is plain and sometimes blunt, and occasionally graceless, in a way that suggests haste rather than craft. What makes it different is the honesty, the specific, unperforming, sometimes uncomfortable honesty of a man writing to no audience at all, correcting himself in real time, noting where the principle had held and where it had not, and returning to the same difficulties year after year, with no sign that he expected them to eventually resolve. Other philosophical documents from antiquity were written for readers, shaped for argument or instruction or persuasion. The Meditations was written for a man who already knew the arguments and had not yet finished learning how to live by them. That is a different kind of document entirely. It is rarer than almost anything else the ancient world left behind. Plato had imagined, 6 centuries before Marcus was born, the particular figure of the ruler who would rather not rule. In the Republic, the philosophers trained to govern the city are described as genuinely preferring the contemplation they have been asked to leave behind. They return to govern not because power attracts them, but because they have understood something the unphilosophical rulers have not, that governance carried out by those who want power is governance in service of the governors, while governance carried out by those who would prefer to be elsewhere is the only kind that can serve anyone but itself. Plato was building an ideal, not a prediction. He was describing the conditions under which political authority might be something other than the organized expression of one group's appetite for control over others. The philosopher king was a thought experiment about legitimacy, about what it would take for governance to be genuinely oriented toward the good of those governed rather than the good of those governing. Marcus had read Plato, or had read accounts of Plato, or had absorbed through his philosophical teachers the broad shape of what Plato had argued. The explicit framework was not his. Marcus's vocabulary was Stoic rather than Platonic, and the Stoic account of duty and rational nature and the expanding circle of moral concern was the actual architecture of his thinking. But the underlying question was the same. What makes a ruler legitimate is not the office, not the army, not the administrative apparatus that makes the trains run, or the ancient Roman equivalent of trains. What makes a ruler legitimate is the orientation of their attention, whether it faces outward toward the governed or inward toward the governing self. Marcus had spent decades trying to keep his attention facing the right way. The Meditations is, among other things, the record of how difficult that effort actually was in conditions far less ideal than anything Plato had described. In a real empire with real enemies on real frontiers, administered by real human beings who were not philosophers and did not always share his preferences. The gap between Plato's vision and Marcus's reality was wide. Plato's philosopher kings governed a city designed in the Republic for governance by philosopher kings, an educational system that identified and cultivated philosophical capacity from childhood, a social structure that removed the philosopher rulers from the kinds of private attachment that might distort their attention. Marcus governed an empire he had not designed and could not redesign, inherited an administrative structure built by people with no particular philosophical commitments, and carried private attachments to his wife, to his children, to the memory of Antoninus, to the life of contemplation he had once believed he might eventually reach, that he was not asked to surrender and could not have surrendered if asked. He was working inside an imperfect inheritance, trying to apply to it something that had been developed under very different assumptions, with no guarantee and no expectation that the result would be tidy. What is striking, reading the Meditations from the distance of nearly 2,000 years, is not that Marcus failed to close this gap. Almost anyone would have failed to close it. What is striking is that he kept trying, kept noting where the gap had opened, kept returning to the principles he believed were worth returning to, without ever pretending in his private writing that the gap had closed. Rillick's Ting, there is no triumphant passage in the Meditations where Marcus declares the practice complete, the virtue achieved, the Stoic ideal finally and fully inhabited. The text does not move toward a resolution it reaches at the end. It circles, as all honest reckoning circles, returning to the same difficulties from slightly different angles, making the same arguments to himself that he has made before, not because he has forgotten them, but because he has discovered that understanding an argument and being governed by it are two very different things, and the distance between them requires a daily crossing that cannot be crossed once and then remembered as done. He was, in this, profoundly ordinary. That is not a small observation. A man at the center of the most powerful political institution of his age, with resources and authority that no private person could imagine, facing the same morning struggle that every person who has ever tried to act on their principles has faced, the stubborn gap between knowing what the good action is and actually doing it, between the principle articulated clearly in the evening and the principle actually operative the following morning when the conditions for its application arrive. Marcus did not transcend this gap by being emperor. He did not transcend it by being a philosopher or by having access to the best philosophical education his world could provide, or by having spent years thinking carefully about the nature of virtue and duty and the right ordering of a life. He lived inside the gap year after year and continued to notice it and continued to write about it and continued to get up and do the day's work. The scholars who have spent the most time with the meditations tend to remark on something that is easy to miss if the book is read as a philosophical treatise, which it is not quite, though it contains philosophical substance throughout. What they remark on is the texture of the practice it records. Pierre Hadot, the French philosopher, who gave probably the most careful account of what the Stoics were actually doing when they described their philosophical exercises, used the word prosoche, continuous self-attention, the sustained practice of watching one's own thinking and responding to what one finds with honesty rather than habit. Hadot read the meditations as the primary surviving record of what this practice actually looked like from the inside. Not described, not theorized, but enacted. The writing itself was the practice. Each passage is not a completed thought, but an act of attention, Marcus directing his awareness toward a difficulty, or a principle, or a temptation, and staying with it long enough to see it clearly, then setting it down. The text is not what the practice produced. The text is the practice itself, in the form it happened to take when the practitioner had a stylus in his hand. This changes how the Meditations reads, or at least it changes what one takes it to be evidence of. It is not evidence that Marcus Aurelius was a philosophical success. It is evidence that he was a philosophical practitioner, a distinction that matters because success would suggest an endpoint, while practice suggests a direction. He was facing towards something consistently over many years with a specific kind of consistency that acknowledges failure without abandoning direction. The self-attention Hadot describes does not assume one will always find admirable material when one looks. It assumes only that looking is better than not looking, and that the quality of a life is shaped more by the sustained direction of one's attention than by any individual act, however large. Marcus had observed the opposite of this in the people around him. He had watched courtiers orient their attention toward approval, adjusting their expressed views daily to match what they believed the emperor wanted to hear, until after enough years of this adjustment, they could no longer tell what they actually thought from what they had learned to perform. He had watched the particular flattery that accumulates around absolute power, not the theatrical flattery of obvious sycophants, which is easy to dismiss, but the subtler kind that arrives dressed as honest counsel and differs from it only in that it bends, slightly but consistently, in the direction of telling the powerful person what they would prefer to be told. Marcus understood that this flattery was corrosive, not because it was unpleasant. It was not unpleasant. That was the problem, but because it slowly replaced the honest self-assessment that good action required. A man who is told often enough that his instincts are sound eventually stops checking them, and a man who stops checking his instincts in private will eventually stop questioning them in public, which is when the damage to the governed begins. The Meditations was, among its many purposes, a guard against this particular corruption. It was the place where the emperor was not the emperor, where the man behind the office spoke to himself with the directness that no courtier would offer and no ceremony permitted. The private voice in the Meditations is not imperial. It is not assured or serene or above the difficulties it is examining. It is a voice that says, with some frequency, that it is doing this badly and needs to do it better. A voice that notes, without self-pity, but also without false equanimity, that certain days are harder than others, certain principles more difficult to hold under certain kinds of pressure. A voice that understands the difference between performing Stoic equanimity and actually having it, and that is honest about which of the two it is managing on a given day. This honesty was not incidental to the practice. It was the practice. The Stoic tradition, from its earliest formulations, had insisted that self-deception was among the most serious obstacles to philosophical progress, not moral failure in the obvious sense, not cruelty or dishonesty toward others, but the quieter failure of refusing to see oneself with clarity. The person who cannot see where they have fallen short cannot know where to direct the next day's effort. The person who has decided, consciously or not, that their virtue is sufficient is the person who has stopped the practice that makes virtue possible. Marcus returned to this in the Meditations repeatedly, in different forms, from different angles, and the return itself was a demonstration of the point. He did not assume that having thought about the importance of honest self-examination, he had therefore achieved it. He kept checking. He kept writing down what he found. Plato's philosopher, ascending from the cave into daylight, sees the sun and understands what it represents. Marcus, in the cave that was imperial Rome, did not claim to have seen the sun. He claimed only to be facing in its direction, and to have found that facing in that direction, even in difficult conditions, was worth the effort, not because it guaranteed anything about outcomes, but because it was the only kind of life he could recognize as actually his own. The image Marcus returned to most often in the Meditations, so often that it functions as something like a signature of his thinking, was the image of the present moment. Not the present as a philosophical concept, not duration as a metaphysical puzzle, but this present, this actual moment of action or decision or endurance, the only location in which anything could ever actually be done. He wrote about it with an urgency that is unusual in the text. The passages about presence have a quality of insistence, of someone reminding himself of something he knows can slip away in the moment his attention relaxes. The Caesars he listed as an exercise in impermanence were not only evidence that great men become dust, they were evidence that the life available to a person is only ever this life, these hours, this particular opportunity to act or fail to act with some measure of the quality he was trying to cultivate. The dust was not a threat. The dust was a reminder that whatever was worth doing needed to be done here. This is what the memento mori practice meant to Marcus, and it was not morbid in the way it might sound to an ear unfamiliar with how the Stoics used it. He was not dwelling on death. He was using the thought of death to clarify the value of the present. If the list of emperors was composed of men whose moments had come and gone, then his own moment was the one he was in, and it was neither infinitely available nor completely spent, and the question was simply what quality of attention he would bring to it. The question was, as always, not philosophical in the grand sense, not a question about the nature of the cosmos or the ground of ethical obligation or the proper definition of virtue. It was a practical question about this morning, this dispatch, this judicial hearing, this general who needed to be trusted or doubted, this frontier that needed to be held or negotiated. The grand philosophical questions were the architecture. The practical question was the building one actually lived in. There is something that happens when the Meditations is read not as a document of what Marcus knew, but as a document of what he was trying to do. The expectations one brings to it shift. Marcus was not a philosophical saint who had achieved the Stoic ideal and then recorded it for posterity. He was a man who had understood the ideal with considerable clarity, who believed it was worth attempting, and who spent the rest of his life attempting it in conditions that made the attempt difficult, without ever quite making it impossible. The difficulty is present in the text. So is the attempt, and between them, in the space that the honest private writing opens up, is something that has turned out to be extraordinarily durable, more durable than most of the formal philosophy written in the same period, more durable than most of the administrative apparatus Marcus maintained with such effort, more durable even than the arguments he was applying, which have been preserved in more systematic forms elsewhere. What has lasted is the quality of the attention itself. The reader in a library in Kyoto, opening the Meditations for the first time, does not need to know the history of the Stoic school, or the political geography of 2nd century Rome, or the details of the Marcomannic Wars. What they encounter is a specific human being, recognizable across the entire distance of time and circumstance, struggling with something they know. The struggle to act on what one believes, the struggle to hold a principle under pressure, the struggle to get up in the morning with some measure of genuine engagement, rather than the hollow motion of going through the forms, the struggle, repeated daily over years, to keep one's attention oriented towards something other than the path of least resistance. Marcus did not win this struggle in the sense that victory would mean the struggle was over. He did not resolve it. He carried it forward, day after day, for nearly 2 decades of active imperial governance, through conditions that a philosophical tradition built in gardens and schoolrooms had not entirely prepared him for. And the manuscript that records this carrying forward survived because someone, at some point, understood that it was worth keeping, not because it was triumphant, not because it demonstrated the Stoic ideal perfectly achieved, because it was honest, with the specific, rare, unflinching honesty of a person talking to themselves in a document they intended no one to read, and finding in that privacy the only form of self-knowledge that can actually be used. The Byzantine monks who copied the Meditations across centuries of manuscript transmission did not know Marcus's face, or his voice, or the particular quality of the Danubian light at the hour when he wrote. They knew only the text, this accumulation of self-directed imperatives, these returns to the same difficulties, this private conversation between a man and his own repeated failures. They copied it because it carried something that did not diminish with copying, that was not depleted by transmission across time and distance and cultural change. The Renaissance humanists who found it centuries later in those copied manuscripts and recognized in a Roman emperor's private journal something that spoke more directly about the interior experience of trying to live well than most philosophy written explicitly for that purpose. They were responding to the same quality, the directness, the refusal to perform equanimity that was not actually felt, the willingness to write for no reader the honest account of what the practice actually looked like from inside. The soldier reading the Meditations in a barracks has found in it something that speaks to the specific experience of obligation maintained under conditions of exhaustion. The person sitting in a hospital waiting room has found in it a voice that does not minimize difficulty or offer false comfort, but insists quietly on the value of continuing to try. The philosopher who has read all of Marcus's philosophical predecessors and knows exactly where each of his arguments came from and how they fit within the tradition has found in the text the thing that the more careful doctrinal formulations cannot quite provide, the feel of the ideas working or failing to work in an actual life under actual pressure in the hands of an actual practitioner who was not performing for anyone. This is what survived, not the empire, which declined in the generation after Marcus died and was transformed almost beyond recognition within 2 more, not the administrative architecture he maintained with such effort, which was rebuilt and dismantled and rebuilt again many times over, not even the philosophical school he had learned from, which continued in various forms, but never again had a practitioner of his particular kind. a man who was genuinely trying, in genuine conditions of power and difficulty, to use it as more than an intellectual possession. What survived was the writing, the private Greek manuscript, unedited, not composed for an audience, carrying in its plain and sometimes blunt sentences the record of a mind that kept turning toward what it believed was worth turning toward, kept asking itself the hard questions, kept writing down what it found. The lamp in a campaign tent burns through the last hour before dawn. The quality of the light at that hour is particular. It has been burning long enough that everything outside its small sphere of influence has settled into deep darkness, and the circle of illumination it casts on the writing surface has the focused quality of light that has been steady for a long time. Inside that circle, a manuscript lies open. The handwriting on its pages is not the careful script of official correspondence. It is the looser, more rapid hand of private writing, the kind that happens when the thought is moving faster than the need to make it legible to others. Passages written months ago are visible at the edges of the page, slightly faded, the ink of their composition already beginning its long process of becoming history. Newer passages are darker, fresher, continuous with the older ones in subject, if not in moment, the same difficulties returning, the same principles being called on, the same effort to close the gap between understanding and action. In a few hours, the camp will begin to wake. Sounds will start arriving, the early movements of soldiers, the distant transaction of guards changing, the particular quality of silence that precedes the organized noise of an army preparing for a day's work on a frontier. The dispatches will arrive. The judicial matters will require attention. The correspondence will need reading and answering. The military assessments will need weighing. The administrative machinery of an empire that spans 5 million square kilometers will generate its daily volume of decisions that only the man in this tent is positioned to make. All of that is coming. For now, there is only the lamp and the page and the pen, and a man who has learned, over many years of practice, that this hour, this specific, quiet, not yet interrupted hour, is where the effort is renewed, not completed, not finished, not arrived at some destination that justifies stopping, renewed. The word in the original carries the sense of something turned back toward its beginning, restored to the condition from which it can begin again. Marcus understood this not as defeat, not as evidence that philosophy had failed to deliver the permanent equanimity it seemed to promise, but as the actual nature of the practice, seen clearly. The Stoic exercises were not meant to produce a state one eventually achieved and could then inhabit without further effort. They were meant to be performed daily in whatever conditions arrived, with whatever measure of philosophical steadiness the day's resources allowed. He would have known by the final years of his life that he was not going to reach the contemplative ease he had imagined in his younger years as the destination of philosophical effort. He was not going to have the time or the circumstances for the kind of sustained philosophical leisure that the tradition had sometimes seemed to hold out as its natural completion. The wars were not going to end cleanly. The administrative obligations were not going to thin. The claims of the governed on the one person positioned to respond to them were not going to diminish simply because he would have preferred a quieter life. He had come to understand that the quieter life was not the one he had been given, and that the Stoic tradition, honestly read, did not ask him to wish for a different life before doing the philosophical work. It asked him to do the philosophical work inside the life that was actually his. What that looks like from the inside is what the Meditations records, not the calm of someone who has made peace with their situation and found it sufficient. Something quieter and more honest than either of those, a man continuing to try, in the actual conditions of an actual life, to hold the orientation he believed was worth holding on a morning when it is not entirely easy, and he knows perfectly well that tomorrow morning it will be required again. The lamp holds its flame in the surrounding dark. The page carries its marks into a future the man writing on it could not have imagined, carried through centuries he would not know, into hands he would never touch, into moments of recognition he could never have predicted. The flame itself will not last. Please